There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant in the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
There was chaos and confusion as police moved in to capture accused high school shooter Nick.
Any available units I can assist?
Over 16%. The Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%. The stock market is now down 21%.
So let's talk about disaster. We're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the sky to fall, for the bad news to reach us. It's an ongoing threat, and it seems like it's more and more prominent in our lives. Parkland, Hurricane Katrina, Afghanistan, 9/11, the Fukushima meltdown, the economic crash of 2008. All of them, and many, many more, not only act as catalysts for neoliberal economic maneuvers like privatization and deregulation, but also as fodder for a faster, more ferocious media machine that digests and redistributes disaster back to us at a premium. Disaster isn't quite the new entertainment, but it has been and remains a very visible presence in North American culture. And that presence entails a number of corollaries in an era of neoliberal capitalism. After reading through this week's texts, I chose to focus on disaster media as my artifact. News about disaster is inescapable, and the impacts of disaster capital continue to resonate and have powerful ramifications in our lives. But the general public has always made time for disaster media, be it the news we watch, the websites we visit, or any slew of disaster-rated films we catch in a theater or on Netflix. Disaster media is the epitome of, if it bleeds, it leads, and it's been leading us for a while, and we often choose this to be the case. The key to understanding my artifact is knowing that disasters can be exploited by taking advantage of the, for lack of a better term, opportunities they create. To a lesser or greater degree, each of our readings embraces this thought. However, this exploitation does not necessarily have to be completely negative or destructive, as Joseph and Fisher point out in their writing. On the other hand, just as roses have thorns, there are drawbacks and pitfalls too. We need to be aware of the dichotomies that surround disaster media, so we can better critique it from an informed perspective. How do we deal with disaster media creating media personalities and stars, for instance? Viva Marcos! Disaster media is multifaceted, so I will focus on particular discrete pieces and aspects of disaster media and connect my questions from the text to them. Since all of you watching this are playing the home game, I've distributed the same questions around the room. Or at least future me has. So let's go ahead and jump in. Part 1. The Shock Doctrine. In the Shock Doctrine reading, Klein discusses how taking advantage of disasters and major problems allows for the expansion of neoliberalism and the exploitation of disasters to ends which do not favor those most affected by them. Klein notes, disaster capitalists have no interest in repairing what was, and talks about how so-called reconstruction finishes the job of the initial disaster, all before the victims of war or natural disaster were able to regroup and state their claims to what was theirs. Klein continues, believers in the shock doctrine are convinced that only a great rupture, a flood, a war, a terrorist attack, can generate the kind of vast, clean canvases they crave. It is in these malleable moments, when we are psychologically unmoored and physically uprooted, that these artists of the real plunge their hands in and begin their work of remaking the world. For Klein, a major collective trauma has always been required for three defining aspects of disaster capitalism: privatization, governmental deregulation, and cost-cutting measures related to social spending, to take root. Klein argues torture is a metaphor of the shock doctrine's underlying logic, and that shock societies often give up things they would otherwise fiercely protect. My contention is that disaster media is yet another cash grab, relating to disasters originating from conglomerates doing the PR work of neoliberal institutions, and by selling us back a mediated version of a reality afflicted by disaster, in reality-based films like 1517 to Paris or The Green Zone, mass media conglomerates can currently distance us from the pain while they sell us back depictions of that same trauma. We remain steeped in disaster and aware of disaster because of its omnipresence. Even our entertainment is disaster. Prompt 1. Describe a disaster capital-related event that impacted either yourself or somebody else in your group. Then discuss the mediated version of it, be it film, news, whatever, and see about the differences between the reality and the depicted version of the reality. Don't worry, we'll do all the discussion points after the video. In the performance of production and consumption, Miranda Joseph aims to point to a strategy of participation, partially by expanding production to highlight, quote, the opportunities for liberatory social change made available within production while critiquing constraints, oppressive innovation, imposed by the mode of production. Along with exploring aspects of both Marxist theories of value and performance, Joseph provokes thoughts about how certain social groups can operate businesses which are examples of production and distribution sites which facilitate the flow of capital by organizing themselves on the basis of, and thus producing, the community with which the business is identified. They become the site and structure through which community enacts its very existence. Joseph discusses how, quote, the shift away from mass rationalization opens the way not only for older kinship structures to re-inhabit production, but for newer social groupings to inhabit the corporation, to manifest themselves as a corporation, end quote. Korean markets, lesbian auto repair shops, and Indian gas stations are all cited as examples. To this end, alternative media networks such as Black Television News Channel, Bounce, Aspire, and Revolt, all of which were created by minorities in the United States, do that same work on media lines. I maintain many of these networks came about by way of the same disaster capitalism we've been discussing. The fracturing of the media in the face of infrastructural changes and media diversification, as well as the 2008 housing market and credit crises and economic downturn, allowed for and incentivized a number of social groups to become their own media, to make their own media. You don't even need your own platform. You can always use YouTube, like this video is doing. This isn't disaster media per se. It's not like war porn or a movie about a giant tsunami, but post-disaster media, and could be considered an upside of disaster capitalism. Although, as we'll see in the next section, it may be a precarious one. Prompt number 2. Offer 3 examples how disaster capital can, in Joseph's words, inspire people to manifest themselves as a corporation. In A Poetics of Resistance, Conant, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, discusses the nature of the Zapatista struggle, its uniqueness, and the threats and the challenges it faces in the face of neoliberalism. The Zapatista struggle in Chiapas is notable in that it cannot be easily pigeonholed. Conant notes, quote, the terms of the communiques, the efforts towards autonomy, and the revivifying of the culture at the heart of Zapatismo show that their struggle is for something at once less tangible and more immediate than mere political control, end quote. As lawyer Santos de la Cruz Carrillo puts it, and I'm quoting again, power wants to make us complicit with money, with lies, with violence. We will not be complicit. Conant notes, if opening a space for democracy without taking state power is the explicit goal of the Zapatistas, then we are talking about a shift in how power is arbitrated, and where in the social fabric it resides. The Zapatistas, however, know the power of media, specifically that of having a strong face in front of it, or at least a strong mask. Conant spends much of his text exploring the writings and the persona of Subcomandante Marcos, the most visible leader and the spokesman of the EZLN. Marcos, who is now going by another name, is as charismatic as the day is long. He is a poet, a guerrilla, and a vehicle by which to communicate the struggle of Mexico's indigenous people against the, quote, stupid improvisation that is neoliberalism, despite he himself not being indigenous. People refer to the media and the people's obsession with this romantic figure as Marco-trafficking. But if the disaster media emerging from the conflict in Chiapas helps to create a star, then how did the EZLN keep Subcomandante Marcos from becoming just another personality? How did his appearance on everything from balloons to pencils not become just another act of guerrilla chic? Even Marcos himself noted he would, quote, play a less protagonistic role in the media, end quote, if he could go back in time. Manuel Rosenthal stated in Conant's text, we admire Marcos, just as we admire Ramona and all the rest of the Zapatistas. We admire Marcos as a figure who symbolizes the struggle. I think that people with mature understanding get this. What we don't like is that this world wants merchandise. Bandanas with pictures of Che, products with the picture of the man with the pipe, and so on. And this leaves people confused. Just like Che, Marcos becomes about merchandise. Marcos was aware of the contradiction that becoming flattened by the media entails. But what of other young people thrust into the disaster media spotlight? How do we deal with disaster media and disaster media makers creating celebrities? Prompt 3. How could an anti-capital movement having a face impact it? List some positive and negative aspects. Capitalist realism. In capitalist realism, Mark Fisher writes about how neoliberalism is an all-encompassing force that drains people, institutions, and communities of their vigor and strength in exchange for profits which, in keeping with Klein, benefit the minority and not the majority. Fisher describes how the neoliberal machine entails the creation and sustainment of a massive bureaucracy. Endless meetings, endless reports, little incentive. Yowza. Ford uses various films, some of which, like Children of Men, are direct examples of disaster media, while others explore metaphorical neoliberal crises, like Heat or Office Space, or symbolic ones, such as John Carpenter's excellent remake of The Thing. The mention of Office Space is notable for us here because of its relatability.
PC load letter? What the fuck does that mean?
To quote Fisher, without a credible and coherent alternative to capitalism, capitalist realism will continue to rule the political economic unconscious. On page 34, Fisher describes how work and life become inseparable in post-Fordist society. He writes how, and again a quote, time ceases to be linear, becomes chaotic, broken down into punctiform divisions. To function effectively as a component of just-in-time production, you must develop a capacity to respond to unforeseen events. You must learn to live in conditions of total instability, or precarity, as the ugly neologism has it. Fisher highlights the brutal nature of life in the neoliberal era. You get used to chaos or you lose. The results don't even seem particularly great for the winners either, as Fisher spotlights the impact modern life is having on his students' mental health. In short, neoliberalism is a huge downer. Fisher says, quote, the effect of permanent structural instability, the cancellation of the long term, is invariably stagnation and conservatism, not innovation. The concern for us here is how disaster media takes advantage of this. Imagine it. Just coming home and talking to a friend, hey, you've been dealing with the ramifications of terrorism and school shootings all day long. Would you now like to spend your hard-earned money on a TV show about Hurricane Katrina or a movie about school shootings? Those are our options. If we're used to precarity, then we can be entertained by precarity, and the dangerous ugliness is just repackaged and resold to us. However, it's not all doom and gloom, as Fisher introduces methods of escape which involve being better than capitalism at its own game. He calls the credit crisis an opportunity, and notes how we could one-up the capital monster by, among other things, getting rid of the endless bureaucracy and allowing worker autonomy in addition to rejecting certain work such as auditing. Fisher writes about how we should avoid managerialism and disassemble the self-surveillance mechanisms which we've internalized. It's a fairly intriguing argument to end a book with, especially a book that opens with a chapter called It's Easier to Imagine the End of the World Than the End of Capitalism. Prompt number 4. Envision and describe an aspect of an anti-capital model, such as that described by Fisher at the end of Capitalist Realism. So, that brings us to our ending. Look, disaster surrounds us. We never know if it's something we can escape, but we can be aware of its impact on our lives and our behavior by utilizing reflection and critique. That we have noticed how much we quote-unquote enjoy disaster in media is a good step, and today's discussion should be quite interesting. Then again, something might happen while we talk. You never really know when something will go wrong.